October 1943. Reinhard Gehlen is head of German military intelligence on the Eastern Front.
Things are not going too well for him right now. He advised Adolf Hitler not to attack at Kursk, and Hitler attacked anyway. Then, in August, Gehlen completely missed the Donbass strategic offensive. Now the Red Army is advancing on Kiev.
Still, at least he has one thing left. His network of agents within the Soviet Union is sending him valuable information.
It is the only thing that he can rely on. Or is it?
Is it? This is Spies and Ties, a series of World War II in real time, and I'm Astrid Deinhard.
And I'm Indy Neidell.
Hello, darlings. Reinhard Gehlen is chief of Fremde Heere Ost, FHO. That's Foreign Armies East.
Right.
A department of the Oberkommando des Heeres which has responsibility for military intelligence in the East.
His predecessor, Eberhard Kinzel, was pretty lazy and pretty useless. He was sacked after the Germans failed to reach Moscow. So when Gehlen was appointed in April 1942, he searched the Wehrmacht for clever men, linguists, geographers, anthropologists, lawyers, people who have analytic brains. He does all this because although he believes that Slavs are inferior, that they are paranoid and less rational than Western Europeans, he thinks that this makes them crafty and dangerous.
His new brain box is set to work analyzing the Red Army from FHO's base next door to the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. What do they get up to there, Indy? I imagine lots of counting tanks and translating endless paperwork. Is that true?
That is part of it. FHO, though, is divided into 5 groups, right? Group 1 receives information from the Luftwaffe and army groups and produces daily situation reports. Group 2 looks at things like Soviet manpower, morale, and political developments. They keep track of the strength, the position, the order of battle of the Soviet units. But there's also some more interesting stuff. Gehlen opens a luxury POW camp where 80 Red Army men are treated as guests, right? Senior officers are given individual rooms, and the men receive the same rations as Wehrmacht soldiers. These prisoners are then interrogated by Russian and Baltic language speakers in Group 3.
And there's also Gehlen's secret weapons, a network of agents in Soviet territory called Thorne. It's made up of anti-communist Red Army officers and stretches from Leningrad to
Kuibyshev to Novorossiysk.
At the center is an officer named Max, real name Alexander Demyanov. He comes from an old aristocratic family forced into poverty by the Bolsheviks. It's not surprising he holds a bit of a grudge. Back in December 1941, he skied across the front line and offered himself to the Germans. They trained him to be an agent, parachuted him back into the Soviet Union, and now he transmits from Moscow. In late 1942, he is appointed junior communications officer at Soviet High Command. The Germans are delighted to have a spy in the enemy camp.
And Max sends over some interesting stuff.
I guess.
A report from October 8th, 1942, right, gives details of troop movements right down to the individual rifle battalions. He also reports on the arrival of Lend-Lease tanks with British and American advisors, and even gives details of a delegation of Soviet officials flying to London. Later that month, Max reports the arrival of 110 new tanks in the Soviet 20th Army sector across the Vazuza River near Rzhev. All this goes hand in hand with reports from frontline units of the German army and radio interceptions. It all points to a buildup of force opposite the German Rzhev salient. Then, on November 6, Max sends over a report about a meeting of the Soviet High Command. It discusses potential Soviet offensives in the near future. It's pretty vague and has a whole load of options, among them an attack at Rzhev.
When that attack at Rzhev comes on November 25, Operation Mars, Gehlen is convinced Rzhev is the big one because it fits with his other reports.
Well, we know how it turns out from the regular episodes. The Red Army loses 100,000 men and 1,600 tanks. The Wehrmacht loses just 40,000 men. It goes down as Zhukov's greatest defeat.
There's a bit of debate about that Operation Mars, isn't it?
Uh-huh.
Wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, what was it?
I talked about it at the time, and that is in fact putting it lightly. See, Operation Uranus was launched in the south on November 19th and began the process of encircling the Sixth Army at Stalingrad. The official view that will be printed in Soviet history books and taught to Soviet intelligence officers is that Mars is a distraction from Uranus to tie down force in the north. So it wasn't a defeat, it was a success. I, and some scholars like David Glantz, am extremely skeptical of this official view for a few reasons, but there are some obvious ones, like that Mars was planned for October 12th and Uranus for November 9th, which is too far apart for either to be a diversion for either. But this official view will get some support in the West as well. And when people talk about all of this, they will point to the very espionage operations involving Max and Gehlen that we're talking about today.
Right. Because there's one very important detail I left out. Max is working for the NKVD.
The NKVD?
He's been in their pay since 1929.
Wow, I didn't expect the NKVD.
Nobody expects the NKVD. It's all part of something called Operation Monastery. General Pavel Zudopladov is in charge. He sent Max over to the Germans back in 1941. When Max was parachuted back in 1942, Zudopladov took over his radio set. The Thorne network is all fake. Falsified radio messages are sent to the Germans, and the NKVD plant reports in the newspapers as evidence of sabotage actions by Thorne. Even Max's family are in on it. They live with him and pose as white Russians who want the monarchy back and restored.
Well, talk about a supportive family.
They are. Well, I'm not sure they had too much choice considering the NKVD are behind it. When Abwehr couriers arrive in Moscow to bring in new transmitters, batteries or money, they're rounded up by the NKVD. Some of them are imprisoned, others become double agents. They go back to German lines and report on the amazing work that Max and Thorne are doing. Zudopladov will later claim that by early 1943, Operation Monastery has captured 23 German agents, 2 million rubles, and lots of radio sets, ammunition, and secret documents. His figures might be a bit exaggerated, but the core of it is truthful. Operation Monastery will expand and continue until the end of the war. It'll score some big successes in 1945.
Right, but does that mean that Operation Mars was a deception? Zudopladov will say that the plans were deliberately leaked to Gehlen via Max.
Yes, and that only he and Joseph Stalin were in on the secret. After the war, Zudopladov will write Zhukov, not knowing that this disinformation game was being played at his expense, paid a heavy price in the loss of thousands of men under his command.
But that's way too neat and tidy. Well, for me anyhow. It makes Zudopladov look like a spy master extraordinaire. Stalin gets to be a ruthless tactician, and Zhukov is just an innocent patsy. And it gets them all off the hook for failure. The reality is that Max and Zudopladov send all sorts of information over to the Germans. Some of it is true, some of it is half true, and some of it is outright lies. That report of November 6 mentions a high command meeting that probably never happened. I certainly cannot find any record of it. But Gehlen seized on the parts of Max's information that supported his theory about Rzhev. And this time it worked out well. And anyway, Mars is a bigger operation than Uranus, and it continues running into the German meat grinder several weeks after it could have been called off if it was only to tie down force. So it's not likely that it was a diversion.
Still, Gehlen believes that Max handed him victory on a silver platter. When people raise doubts, he furiously defends Max as indispensable.
Indispensable.
He will hold this belief to the grave.
Let's take a moment to look at the bigger picture, okay? After the fall of Stalingrad, the momentum swings to the Soviets. This brings us to Kursk, summer 1943.
Gehlen and FHO initially support the idea of an offensive at Kursk, but this changes as the operation is repeatedly delayed by Hitler.
Yeah, throughout May and June, FHO gathers accurate intelligence about Soviet defensive buildup. The Luftwaffe collect images of frontline defenses, and deeper reconnaissance flights provide data on Soviet road and rail traffic. By comparing this to standard levels of supply traffic, FHO can tell that something big is in the works. Also, the Wehrmacht has been running a propaganda campaign to convince Soviet troops to defect. What is it called, Astrid?
Silberstreif, darling. It means silver lining.
Right, Silberstreif. It is not actually much of a success, considering the resources they put into leaflets and other propaganda. But between April and June 1943, 60% of the 6,300 prisoners taken by Army Group Center are deserters. They give the Germans a good idea of unit strengths and order of battle. There's also just plain good old signals intelligence. The Germans have not broken the high-level ciphers used by the Soviet military, but they can access the lower-level stuff.
Right. With all this information, Gehlen advises Hitler on July the 3rd and July the 4th that it would be unwise to proceed. He writes on the 4th about the Soviet preparations. They have done everything in their power to hold our offensive as soon as it begins. Thus, there is little likelihood that the German offensive will achieve a strategic breakthrough.
But Hitler has made his mind up. The attack goes ahead and, well, if you've watched the regular episodes, then you know how it turns out.
Gehlen had also missed one very important thing, and what was that?
Well, he'd actually missed 570,000 important things. The men of Ivan Konev's rifle divisions held in reserve east of Kursk. They are crucial to the outcome of the battle. But even if he had known about them, would it have changed Hitler's mind? We do not know. But we do know that the Wehrmacht is so stretched across all fronts that it just cannot compete with the numbers that the Soviets can deploy. And the Soviets are just getting started. As Astrid said, Gehlen was completely blindsided by the Soviet strategic offensive in the Donbass.
Gehlen will cling to the belief that defeat can be staved off somehow. His continued faith in Max will bring even more disastrous consequences in 44 and 45. Eventually, though, he becomes more concerned with saving his skin. Later in the war, he will latch onto the tensions brewing between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. He reckons that the West will soon be looking for people with experience fighting Soviet communism.
And who might that be? Perhaps the head of German military intelligence on the Eastern Front is a good candidate. There is the old saying, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. I think we should keep our eyes out for Reinhard Gehlen when this war draws to its conclusion.
If you would like to see more about the people that fooled old Reinhard, click here for my video on the NKVD and GRU. And if you like more videos like this and more videos in general, then join the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. And I will see you next time, darlings.